Tere päevast head külalised nii selles ilusas saalis siin Narva kolledžis kui ka veebis. Mul on hea meel täna avada ühte toredat konverentsi siin Narva kolledžis, mis räägib Põhjasõjast ja Uusikaupungi rahulepingust. Kõik need sündmused, millest me täna räägime, konverentsi esimeses pooles leidsid aset väga ammu, aga Põhjasõda on siiamaani eestlaste mälus legendidena, mälestistena, sest see suur heitlus siin vanal Liivi ja Eestimaal jättis oma jälje. Mina olen Anneli Reima, töötan küll igapäevaselt Kultuuriministeeriumis ja tegelen lõimumise ja rahvusvaheliste suhetega, aga täna esindan ma siin Jõhvi muuseumi seltsi, mis on selline väike mittetulundusühing, mis tegeleb siinse ajaloo tutvustamisega, jäädvustamisega ja me oleme võtnud oma ülesandeks korraldada ka konverentse, anda välja raamatuid kõigest sellest, mis kunagi on toimunud siin Ida-Virumaal. Ja just täna 300 aastat tagasi, see on siis 10. septembril 1721, kirjutati alla Soomes Uusikaupungis rahulepingu, mis lõpetas suure Põhjasõja, mis jättis oma jälje nii Eestimaale kui ka Euroopale tervikuna, sest et see oli väga suur heitlus ülevõimu pärast Läänemerel, kus oli ühe pool siis Rootsi riik, teisel pool Vene tsaaririik ja sõja lõppedes siis muutus Vene tsaaririik siinseks suurvõimuks Vene keisririigiks. Ja kõigest sellest, mis see Uusikaupungi rahu endaga kaasa tõi, me täna räägimegi, sest et need tingimused, millega siis toona alistuti või Venemaa koosseisu üle mindi, mis see tegelikult tähendas. Ja tänane konverents on meil siis nagu öeldud hübriidvormis, et kõik need, kes tahavad kuulata tõlget, peavad kasutama selleks eraldi veebikanalit. Ja selleks siis kõik, kes registreerusid, said ka endale vastava lingi ja meie konverentsi esimene osa on siis eestikeelne ja teine pool siis inglisekeelne, nii et te peate vaatama seda Narva kolledži veebilehte, mille nimi on tv.narva.ut.ee. Kõik need, kes on veebis, aga need, kes istuvad meil saalis, need kuulevad tõlget kõrvaklappides. Ja mul on väga hea meel anda sõna Kati Raikile, kes on meil väga tuntud inimene, ajaloolane, poliitik, omavalitsustegelane, kirjutanud ääretult palju toredaid raamatuid Narva ajaloost ja annan talle tervituses kui ettekandeks sõna.
Tere päevast kõigile. Kõigepealt Narva on maailmalinn, Narva oli, on ja on tulevikus maailmalinn. Narva kuulub väga mitmete maade ajalukku ja ei ole mõtet vaielda, kas Narva kuulub esimeses järgus Eesti, Vene, Saksa, Rootsi, Taani ajalukku. Narva kuulub kõikide nende riikide ajalukku ja minul oli kunagi väga muljetavaldav, kui ma Rootsis ja Saksamaal käies sain aru, et kõik koolilapsed teavad Narvat läbi selle, et nad on koolis õppinud Narva lahingut 1700. aastal. Mul on väga hea meel, et see tänane konverents toimub just siin Narvas, just siin Narva kolledžis, ka minu jaoks väga koduste seinte vahel. Ja on üsna omamoodi, et selle konverentsi idee ei ole tulnud Narvast. See on tulnud Timo Hellenbergilt Soomest, aitäh teile Timo selle initsiatiivi eest, aitäh Anneli sulle selle konverentsi ellukutsumise eest ja selle eest muretsemise eest. Ja ma läheksin siit edasi tõepoolest rääkima natuke siis sellel samal teemal Põhjasõjast ja Narvast, kui me ütleme Uusikaupungi rahu, siis me mõtleme Põhjasõda. Ja kui me Narvas ütleme Põhjasõda, siis me mõtleme Peeter Esimest. Ja tahaksingi teha nii mitte ettekande, vaid rääkida sellest, mis on see põhjus ja minu käest on seda väga palju küsitud, miks tänaseni on Peeter Esimene Narva linna esimene kangelane. Miks ei ole näiteks eestlaste Paul Keres? Peeter on kindlasti tähtsam. Narva linna inimeste arvates, ja see on üks 10 aasta tagune töö meie Narva kolledži üliõpilaste töö kohalike linnaelanikega, kus küsiti, kes on linna tähtsaim kangelane, see oli pretsedenditud Peeter Esimene. Ja Peeter Esimest nimetati linna asutajaks, kogunisti linnuse ehitajaks. Osad ütlesid, et just sellepärast on Narva Euroopa, et siin oli Peeter Esimene, teised ütlesid, et just sellepärast on Narva peab kuulma venelastele, et Narvas oli Peeter Esimene. Igal juhul on Peeter Esimene tähtis ja võimalik, et ajas on juba need suhtumisedki muutunud. Aga mulle meeldib väga üks lause, mille ma kirjutasin lausa üles. Tänaseks здесь побил всех, on здесь побил всех, окно в Euroopa здесь võõri. Ta võitis siin kõiki ja rajas just siit akna Euroopasse. Nii et Narva inimesed saavad väga hästi aru, et Narva ajalugu oleks võinud olla täiesti teistsugune, kui 1700. aastal ei oleks siin võitnud mitte 18-aastane Peeter, vaid 18-aastane Karl 12, vaid 28-aastane Peeter Esimene Narva all. Siis oleks Peeter siin leidnud endale vajalikud laevateed ja kivist linna ja Narva oleks võinud rajada Vene riigi teise pealinna. Peeter Esimese kultuse juured viivad tagasi täitsa selgelt 18. sajandisse Katariina teise aega, aga ma tuletan meelde, et Narvas on ka olnud mitmeid otse Peetriga seotud asju, millest tänagi räägitakse ja nii Peetri kultust elus hoitakse. Õigupoolest on tänagi olemas meil Peetri plats, mille nimetus tuleb Peetri väravatest, mis omakorda said nimetuse Peeter Esimesest. Meil on olemas Peetri kool. Kerese ringi nimetame vahel Peetri ringiks. Kas me siis ka Peetri Esimese peale mõtleme, see on ise asi. Küll on Narvas olnud mitu Peetri Esimese mälestusmärki ja siin suurel ekraanil, ma loodan, et see on näha ka neile, kes siin ruumis ei ole, on Peeter Esimese mälestusmärk, mis asus Raekoja platsil otse siin meie ees, see õnnetu sammas, mis samal ajal kui Peeter Esimese mälestusmärk Tallinnas maha võeti ja Kadriorgu viidi, siis siingi võeti Peeter Esimese mälestusmärk maha. Üks Peeter Esimese mälestusmärk oli ka Narva jões, aga sedagi enam ei ole selle olla vesi kaasa võtnud. Teine tähtis asi, mis Peetrit meenutas ja mis tänaseni oma elu elab, tulen korra mälestusmärgi juurde tagasi. Mälestusmärgist mäletate vahest 2009. aastal, 12 aastat tagasi, oli selline mõte panna Narvas uuesti püsti Peeter Esimese mälestusmärk, mille rinnakuju pidi olema siis sarnane sellele, mis kunagi oli Tallinnas. Ja muide, see rinnakuju on tänaseni alles kusagil volikogu keldris. Mina olin toona suhteliselt noor, Narvas oli ja mina ei saanud aru, mille pärast see Peeter Esimene pandi pesemata aknaklaasi taha, et aknaklaasi oleks pidanud ikka ära pesema. Aga Peetri mälestusmärk ei toona püsti panemata ja toona meie peaminister Andrus Ansip rõhus sellele, et Peeter Esimene on küüditaja, sellepärast ei tohi seda mälestusmärki siis uuesti püstitada. Arvamus oli seinast seina toona. Ja kindlasti, kui selle mälestusmärgi oleks saanud kas või 3 tunniks Narvas püsti panna, oleks olnud suur asi. Siia oleks kohale sõitnud ajakirjanikud nii Tallinnast kui Peterburist ja see oleks saanud sellest suure poliitilise sündmuse. Teine asi, millega seoses ikkagi Narvas Peeter Esimesest tänaseni räägitakse, on Peeter Esimese maja. Tõsi, nüüd nimetatakse seda maja aina rohkem, ka selle maja tegeliku ehitaja Nüümanni, Kingsepp Nüümanni järgi Peeter Esimene ostis ju selle maja. See majagi on siit kiviviske kaugusel vahest 150 meetrit jõe poole, Rüütli tänava, vana ajaloolise Rüütli tänava otsas. Siin on see maja selline, nagu ta oli peale sõda. siis 1970. aastateni. Enne sõda 20-30 aastatel. Maja saatus oli see, et läks Peeter Esimese käest tema naise pärandisse, naise käest linna kätte ja siis lõpuks oli seal Peeter Esimese muuseum siis 20-30 aastatel. Ja nüüd on siis Peeter Esimese maja taastamine üks selline asi, millest Narvas ikka räägitakse ja õigupoolest on vanalinna suhtes kolm usku inimesed. On need, kes üldse ütlevad, et pole vaja, aga seda ei julge keegi kõva häälega välja ütelda, sest see on ebapopulaarne eelkõige valimisteel. Ja siis on kolm usku inimesed, kes ütlevad, et tuleb ehitada üles üks maja, Peeter Esimese maja. Need, kes ütlevad, tuleb ehitada üles üks kvartal. Noh siis me oleme praegu kokku leppinud, et Rüütli tänava põhjakülg siinsamas, kus on suuresti linnale kuuluv ala ja võimalik oleks üks kvartal üles ehitada. Ja need, kes ütlevad, et üles tuleb ehitada kõik 400 maja, mis olid siis bastionite vööndis. See on muidugi hullumeelne idee ja tegelikult ei ole mingit kaalukat põhjust siis Hruštšovkade maha võtmiseks ja sellele siis kohalikult elanikkonnalt ka mingit toetust ei saa. Aga tagasi Peeter Esimese kultuse juurde. See iseenesest on, või kus on selle kultuse juured, et me saaksime aru, miks Peeter Esimene kogu aeg ikkagi meiega endiselt on. See on Nikolai Sauerveidi maal aastast 1859. Peterburi kunstide akadeemialt sai see maal väikese medali oma aja kohta, suur teos. Näeme Peeter Esimest, Ratsul, raekoda ja börsihoonet. Ajaloolist hoonete tõdesid nüüd otsida ei maksa. Samas börsihoone, mis teatavalt asus selle maja ees, kus me praegu oleme, oli tõepoolest torm 1876. aastani. Aga Peeter Esimese kultusest ja ma ütlen kohe, see ei tekkinud mitte ainult Venemaal ja mitte ainult Nikolai Karamzinil, Vene ajaloolase 1821. aastal ja seejärel kirjutas Peeter Esimese kangelastegudest, kuidas ta lihtrahvast kaitstes, juba Aleksander Puškin ise 1835. Hiljem jõudis Peeter Esimese kuju kui Narva inimeste kaitsja kuju ka Aleksei Tolstoi romaani, aga juba ka mujal. Näiteks Inglise reisikirjaniku Nadia Braxali, kes hiljem oli Inglise parlamendi liige ja ajaloolane. Tema kirjutas Peeter Esimesest üsna positiivses võtmes tema võistlustest Narva all, aga kirjutas ka sellest, kuidas siis Peeter Esimene Narva kodanikke küüditas aastal 1908. Väidetavasti jäi 3000 inimesest Narva elama 300 linnakodanikku. Ja Braxali järgi oli see nii, et minu jaoks oli see huvitav, et kui Braxal oli siin aastal 1774, siis oli küüditamisest möödas ja oli sisuliselt 70 aastat, 60-70 aastat. Sama palju kui meil mõneski mõttes, eks ju, samas suurusjärgus. Ja siis rääkisid Narva inimesed talle, et ellu oli jääd väike poisike, keda Vene sõdurid peksid, väike sülelaps. Jäeti ta kuskile maha, aga ometi ta amm leidis ta ja mees jäi ellu. Ja teine lugu on hoopistükist mees, kes linnakodanik, kes räägib oma emast, kes olla küüditatud Venemaale ka Moskva taha Kaasanisse, aga tema õel oli parem saatus, õesse armus üks pojaar, vene aadlik ja see pojaar aitas siis selle mehe ema, aga omakorda pöördus elu teistpidi ja seesama pojaar oli Peeter Esimese soosiku Menšikovi lähikondlane ja hiljem tuli siis selle poisi emale aidata juba pagedusse sattunud oma õde. Nii et selline Peeter Esimese kultus ja Peeter Esimese jutud, aga ka Peeter Esimese kujutamine rahvakaitsjana. Sama Braxal kirjutab, et Peeter Esimene andnud Henning Rudolf Hornile, Rootsi komandandile, vastu lõugu bastioni peal. Selle eest, et ta ei andnud linna ära käest, kuigi nägi, et ta 50 kahurist töötab vaid üks. Aga see, kuidas me siin näeme Peeter Esimest Ratsul, ma loeksin teile ette Aleksei Puškini kirjanduse. Seda ei olegi vist nii mugav mul siit lugeda. Narvas algas röövimine. Sõdurid peksid tänavatel kõiki, kes neile ette sattusid. ega kuulanud ülemusi, kes käskisid inimestele halastada. Peeter tormas paljastatud mõõgaga nende sekka ja ta torkas 2 sõna kuulmatut surnuks. Mul läks vahepeal täitsa meelest ära, et meil on tõlgid ka. Seejärel istus ta ratsu selga, kappas Narva tänavad läbi, käskis ähvardavalt lõpetada tapmised ja röövimine, pani igale poole, ise ärenes kirikute ja panemate majade ette, välja vahipostid ning saabus värisevate linnakodanikega täidetud raekoja juurde. Just selline on see Sauerveidi maal. Juhin tähelepanu siis Aleksander Puškini sõnade järgi. Nähes nende keskel ka horni, andis Peeter oma tuhinas talle kõrvakiilu ja ütles vihaselt. Kas mitte sina ei ole selles süüdi? Sul ei olnud mitte mingisugust lootust abi saada ega vahendit linna päästmiseks. Nii et kas sa ei võinud siis juba ammu valget lippu välja panna? Seepeale jätkas ta verest punetavat võõka näidates. Vaata, ütles ta, see ei ole mitte Rootsi, vaid Vene veri. Ma torkasin omasid surnuks, et hoida tagasi omaenda sõdureid, kelles oma kangekaelsusega marru ajasid. Nii et nii sai Peeter esimesest lihtrahva Narva inimeste kaitsja. Ta tappis oma sõdureid, et kaitsta Narva lihtrahvast. Just sellest kõleneb see Sauerveidi maal ja just seal on selle Peeter esimese kultuse juured. Veel kord mitte ainult siis Vene ajalookirjutuses ja vene kirjanduses, aga siiski valdavalt seal. Muidugi tuleb veel rõhutada, et tollases sõjapidamises ei olnud ju midagi erilist tapmises ja röövimises. See käis sõjapidamise juurde. Ent ometi. Peeter esimene on Narvaga väga mitmeti seotud. 1700. aastal oli ta 2 kuud Narvas, teatavasti ta lahkus Narva lahingu ajal, nähes, et ta ei saa siin võitu. 1704. aastal piirati Narvat 2 kuud. Peeter ise juhtis Narva tormijooksu Narvale, mis muide oli 2 bastioni, Victoria ja Honori bastioni vahet. Esmapilgul nii kindel koht, kuidas just sealt linna sai tungida, aga see oligi rootslastele ka ootamatu, pigem oodati rünnakut Rakvere poolt. 1706. aastal Narvas, 1708. aastal 5 päeva. Kõik see on ajalooürikutest. Toona nimetas ta issanda muutmise peakiriku ühe Narva, või õigupoolest Narva kõige vanema kiriku, millest on teated juba 15. sajandi keskpaigast, ümber issanda muutmise peakirikuks. Ja see jäi oli algselt katoliku kirik, siis Luteri kirik, jäi õigeusu kirikuks kuni puruks pommitamiseni 44. aastal. Kuni revolutsioonini viidi iga aasta läbi Narvas 9. augustil suur ristikäik. Hiljem käis Peeter esimene Narvast lühemalt, aga siiski. Aastad 1712, 1713, 14, 16, 17, teatavasti Peeter esimene suri 1725. Need olid läbisõidud pigem läände või teel tagasi laevaga või mööda maanteed. 1721. aastast, sellest samast Nüstadi aastast, selline mälestus tema kasvamast. Narva была в такой бедности, что я не мог достать на дорогу чего-нибудь естного и принужден был припасай, что заказать нельзя. Et Narvast ei olnud võimalik leida midagi söödavat, Narva oli selle võrra vaene keerulises olukorras, et tuli varastada. Nii et Narvale ei toonud see põhjasõja aegne lugu suurt õnne, põhjasõja järgne lugu sellisest maailmalinnast Narvast, kus elasid inglased ja hollandlased, sai pigem väiksem provintsilinn, ehkki tõsi, veel 18. sajandil oli Narva, Peterburi ja Riia kõrval tähtis sadam Läänemere ääres. Ent ometi tuli rahuaeg, mida tuleb kõrgelt ka hinnata. Peeter esimese vaim elab Narvas edasi, see on selge. Aga ei maksa seda ka kuidagi üle dramatiseerida või arvata, et meie Narva inimesed kuidagi sellepärast Venemaa poole hoiame, et Peeter esimene on tähtis. Rootsi lõvi, mis omamoodi on mälestus Karl 12. on samamoodi Narva inimeste jaoks kallis. Narva inimeste jaoks on need kohad kallid, kus pulmade puhul käiakse fotosid tegemas ja nendeks on nii Rootsi lõvi, Narva kolledž kui tank T34. Nii et selline suur ajaloo segapuder meil siin Narvas on, aga Peetri kultus elab edasi ja lõpetuseks räägin ühe legendi, mida ikka armastatakse Narvas rääkida. Et Peeter Esimene käinud Narvas juba Rootsi ajal 17. sajandi lõpul. Teatavasti oli tollel ajal selline luuramine täitsa kombeks, ta oli ju pikk mees iseenesest ja Rootsi sõdurid näinud, et on võõras inimene linnas ja läinud teda otsima. Teatavasti oskas Peeter Esimene ka saksa ja hollandi keelt ja sai kohalike linnakodanikega seetõttu kergesti kontakti. Väidetavalt olla olnud peidetud linnapea Kõtse naise seelikusaba alla, see ei ole väga usutav, et nii suur mees ära mahtus, aga teine lugu, mille ma olen leidnud Eesti Kirjandusmuuseumist, oli see, et Peeter Esimene viidi linnast välja prügikoormas. See on nagu loogilisem, pikk mees mahtus ära, teatavasti tuli linnast prügi siis välja viia bastionite ringi taha. Need on lood, mida mina olen tänini Narvas Peeter Esimesest kuulnud, et Peeter Esimene on maailmamees ja kindlasti ka Narva suurkuju. Usun, et see on nii täna ja usun, et mina julgen uskuda, et 10 aasta pärast on Peeter Esimese maja üles ehitatud, nimetatakse teda nii Peeter Esimese majaks kui Nüümani majaks ja asub seal Narva linna ajaloomuuseum, kus on oma koht nii 17. sajandil kui Peeter Esimesel, sest need kuuluvad omavahel paratamatult kokku. Aitäh!
Suur tänu, Katri, väga põneva sissejuhatuse eest. Aitäh sulle, väikene magus kingitus ka selle ettekande eest. Aitäh sulle.
Aitäh.
Ja, palun.
Aitäh.
Ja tõepoolest Narval on väga kirev ajalugu. Narva on olnud väga tähtis linn siin kahe suure riigi piiril ja ka nagu siin räägitud oli, et palju sõdasid oli Narvas. Siin on ju 2 uhket linnust üksteise vastas mõlemal pool piirijuge. Nii et Narva on tegelikult toonud Eestile kuulsust, on jätnud oma jälje ka Rootsi ajalukku. Ja edasi me räägime juba siis nüüd Uusikaupungi rahust. Ja nagu öeldud, see tänane konverents on rahvusvaheline konverents, et siin meiega saalis istub Timo Hellenberg, kellega mainis Katri, kes on ise oma suguvõsa pidi midagi seotud selle Eestiga, eks ta hiljem võtab sõna ja räägib sellest. Ja selle konverentsi kaaskorraldajaks on ka Leedu kaitsefond. Nii et me oleme tegelikult mitme riigi poolt püüdnud panna õla alla, et tänane konverents saaks teoks ja nii oleksid ka väga põnevad ja toredad esinejad. Ja mul on väga hea meel kutsuda siia Marju Soota-Klutsu, kes on Tartu Ülikooli professor ja õigusajaloo teadlane, võiks öelda, ka õpetatud Eesti Seltsi esimees, tegelenud väga põhjalikult kõigi nende lepingutega, mis kunagi ajaloos on sõlmitud. Ja täna siis me kuulame sellest, mida see Uusikaupungi leping tegelikult endaga kaasa tõi, mis ta Baltimaadele tähendas, sest et me teame, et oli leping, aga mis seal sisaldus, sellest siis täpsemalt räägib Marju. Nii et palun, ma annan talle üle mikrofoni.
I'm very grateful to the organizers of this forum for the opportunity to speak here and to throw some light of the question of how the contents of Nystad peace treaty influenced the further legal and constitutional order and the developments in the Baltic provinces, which had formerly belonged to the Swedish kingdom, but had by then already come under Russian rule. I would like to follow the example of the organizers of our event and begin with the excerpt from the Wikipedia page Treaty of Nystad. The treaty enshrined the rights of the German Baltic nobility within Estonia and Livonia to maintain their financial system, their existing customs border, their self-government, the Lutheran religion and the German language. Its summary of the peace treaties, articles 9 and 10, which followed after eternal peace. We know how many wars followed the great Nordic War. Eternal peace on land and sea, that was established in Article 1. All hostilities were committed to oblivion in Article 2. All military action ceased. Sweden agreed to cede to Russia, Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, also part of Karelia. Russia agreed to evacuate Finland and to pay Sweden $2 million compensation. Sweden was granted the entitlement to trade in Riga, Reval and Arendsburg and purchase grain duty-free. Russia agreed not to interfere in Swedish domestic affairs, and the border between the two realms in Karelia and Ingria was defined in detail. All these issues were primarily concerned with establishing peace and even friendship between the parties of the treaty. This is also the case about the articles in the last part of the treaty, following the articles 9 to 12 that are concerned with the inner affairs of Baltic provinces. As I said before, this excerpt from the Wikipedia page summarizes articles 9 and 10. The articles 11 and 12 were considerably longer, with article 12 being the longest article in the whole peace treaty. In terms of their effect, however, these verbose articles remained rather short-term, regulating which lands had to be returned to their former owners and under which conditions former Swedish subjects could leave or remain in these henceforth Russian lands. Article 5, which concerned the return of Finland, was comparable length. While the return of Finland was meant to take place in 3 weeks, the property and subordination relations in the Baltic provinces were supposed to be regulated over the course of 3 years. This was also a short period of time compared to the century or two in the Baltic internal order that was influenced by articles 9 and 10. In the context of my presentation today, it is therefore these 2 articles in particular that are of primary importance. Article 9 talked about the retention of privileges. His Majesty promises that all the inhabitants of Livonia and Estonia shall be preserved, handled and protected in accordance with the privileges, customs, rights and justices they had already under the Swedish government. Unlike claimed on Wikipedia, there is not a single word about such details as financial system, the existing custom border, the self-government of Baltic nobility, or use of German language in the local official relations and institutions. However, there is indeed direct mention of the retention of evangelical or Protestant confession in Article 10 of the peace treaty. This was supposed to be carried out as an expression of a general freedom of religion or conscience. A similar freedom was also supposed to guarantee to the Orthodox Church. By the time the Neustadt peace between Sweden and Russia had been concluded, the Baltic provinces had already for more than 10 years stood under the Russian rule. When the troops of Tsar Peter the Great had conquered the mainland parts of Livonia and Estonia, and also threatened to conquer their capitals, the Russian command proposed to the local estates that they subject themselves to the Russian Tsar's merciful government, or, in other words, capitulate. After the Second World War, the unconditional surrender of Germany to the Allies became known as capitulation. In terminological and legal, especially in legal historians' sense, it is nonsense. For the whole of earlier history, capitulation had always meant the opposite, surrender under certain conditions. The surrendering party wrote down their conditions, capitula, often also called as puncta, puncta, or accords, and the conqueror either approved or rejected them. In most cases, this was done already in the middle of warfare, and the first approver of the conditions of surrender would be a military leader, rather than the ruler personally. But after the conquest had already taken place, the new subject had to pay homage, in German Huldigung, to the new ruler. It could also happen that they needed to negotiate one or another condition with the rulers separately, before the ruler himself would confirm this capitula. In essence, these were contracts of governance, German Herrschaftsverträge. That's the legally correct quotation of the map on the former slide. In 1710, there weren't only one or two surrendering treaties concluded in the Baltic provinces, but there were a considerable number of them. I have also one example from the puncta of city of Reval, the Estonian capital Tallinn. But I turn to the list of capitulations. Very similarly to the Nystad Peace Treaty, these articles, 266 altogether across all the capitulations, regulated in great detail the property rights of the individuals who would either remain or had a right to leave, as well as the stature of all sorts of property. Also amnesty for deeds committed during the war, the conditions under which military equipment could be taken along, and so on and so on. Again, the articles of lasting importance were the tools that concerned the preservation of the existing legal order and constitutional order, as well as the evangelical confession and the institutions connected to it. Articles of that nature can even be found in the capitulations of departing military units, even though one would assume that such conditions would be presented only or primarily by the institutions of authority that would remain put, the towns and the local knighthoods. This way of surrendering conditionally was a long-standing tradition which in Europe reached back to the antiquity. There's some publications about it from Jürgen von Ungern-Sternberg, the former professor of ancient history at the University of Basel. The previous changes in ruling power over the Baltic lands had taken place in the same way, through the conclusion of similar treaties between the new ruler and the local estates. The knighthoods and town magistrates were not just some vague or even homogeneous Baltic German nobility, as we would like to call this privileged upper class today. Instead, they were the local authorities that were responsible for whole local governance. The Ancien regime, or the European pre-modern state-based constitutional order, always and overall included such middle-ranking or intermediary authorities. The states and their institutions of governance and power were weak or still in development. while the traditional intermediary power had their own functioning institutions and relationships. In this sense, the text of the Nystad Peace Treaty was very exact. It did not discuss just the privileges of the nobility, but privileges which had belonged to the nobles and nobles and the towns, magistrates, guilds and associations, a lot of subjects. In the tradition of medieval and early modern Europe, the ruler of the state did not rule over his subjects directly, but rather did it through the estates and the state-based institutions. For this reason, it is not historically accurate to say that the Nystad Peace Treaty or the capitulations of 1710 confirmed the self-government of the nobility. Self-government is a modern term, but the power of the estates of ancien regime went further than just their autonomous decision-making rights in the internal matters of their corporation. The magistrate of a town would hold all administrative and judicial power in its town, which it did not share with the supreme authority above its sovereign. But depending on the constitution of the particular town, it did share it with local guilds and sometimes also with local zünfte of artisans. Although Reval was the capital of Estonia, the power of his magistrate did not reach outside the town walls. Outside, it was the Estonian knighthood that ruled the land. By the way, even the central part of Tallinn, the Dome Hill, was ruled over by Estonian land law and the authority of the knighthood, not the authority of the Tallinn magistrate. Very similar today. Elsewhere in Europe, the rulers increasingly managed to assert their sovereignty or the authority of the state against the estates, and gradually stated to impose general rules and regulations directly on their subjects. The Russian Empire, created by Peter the Great, however, was still for a very long time dependent on the intermediary authorities. And this was especially the case in the conquered western borderlands, where it was impossible or probably also unreasonable to use the same mechanism of power as in the interior governorates of Russia. Every new ruler ascending to the throne of Russia would, alongside all sorts of other treaties, also confirm the surrendering treaties of the Baltic towns and knighthoods. Hereby, it is also important to point out that neither the capitulations nor the peace treaties granted the local estates the right to shape the local legal order according to their wishes and their best judgment in changing circumstances. The capitulations and treaties concluded with the Russian Tsar, but just like all earlier ones, always discussed only already existing privileges, customs, rights and justices. When the Tartu University, which had ceased its activities in 1700 due to the war, was re-established in 1802, it also had to teach the law that was valid in the Baltic provinces. This demanded a great deal of precise historical work and collection. The continued validity of already existing law and privileges, which had been confirmed time and time again, kept on as current law, for example, the medieval and also early modern codifications of law from 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, as well as old town laws and orders of magistrates. The Swedish and Polish rulers had also added something on their part, as had the Russian central administration. If the provincial intermediary authorities wanted to retain their real power of rule on the basis of the capitulations of 1710 and the Neustadt Peace Treaty, they could not change this set of rules. In the opposite case, the Russian central administration could have said that they were in breach of the contract of governance. But this also meant that neither could the Russian central administration enact laws that did not comply with the already existing local law, because then the Baltic states could have accused them to having breached the contract. Christian Tabelov, who became a professor of law in Tartu 1819, characterized the local legal situation of the Baltic provinces as a historical stew, where every time period had added something, but the decision makers of following period could not in their turn discard anything, or even start from scratch and cook up something new and modern, meaning adopt completely new and up to date laws. This logic was still followed by the codification of local private law, completed in 1864, which brought together norms originating in 9 different legal orders, while also preserving all their pluralism in content. I come to conclude. Although the Russian Emperor Alexander III left the Baltic capitulation unconfirmed, and judicial authority, for example, was taken away from the local estates during the so-called Russification era, this judiciary was nevertheless not fully integrated into the general system of justice of the Russian Empire. Thanks to the Neustadt Peace Treaty and the capitulations already concluded in 1710, the Baltic provinces preserved until the end of the Russian Empire their special legal order and constitution, which was still state-based, but nevertheless different from that of the Russian interior governorates. After the First World War, the Estonian politicians, very similar to the Baltic German nobility, hated the Baltic German nobility. The Estonian politicians also used against the Russian central administration, amongst other things, the argument that the region had always enjoyed an autonomous order different from Russia, and thus the new Russia should also accept Estonian autonomy or even its separation from the Russian state. I come to Peter the Great. Perhaps the statue of Peter the Great should have been preserved in Tallinn. In this paradoxical way, he paved the way for the Estonian independence. I don't mean it very seriously, and I'm very grateful for the attention.
Well, thanks so much, Marju. It was fantastic and very interesting presentation. And all this juridical environment and this background is much clearer for me personally, because I also, when I was a history student, I sat a lot in the archives, and also this period was my subject this time. But now I would like to give the floor to Pekka Visuri, who is a retired Army colonel of the Finnish Army, and has worked a long time at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki, and as well in Alexander Institute at the University of Helsinki, and has been adjunct professor at the National Defense University in Helsinki. So Professor Pekka Visuri, the floor is yours, and we are listening to your presentation with very big interest.
Ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation to present views, main points of 300 years history. And I will present these first on the basis of maps from this new, very excellent book, which is written over Great Nordic War. And first, the situation in the beginning of the war, or just before it. It was Swedish Empire, Kingdom of Sweden, or Sweden, now we say only Sweden, which dominated whole Baltic Sea area. And that was why Denmark, Russia, and then Saxony, Poland, Lithuania allied towards Swedish dominance and began war actions next year. Swedish central figure, King Karl, I say Karl, Swedish, the 12th, was very young, 17 old when the war began. And the opponents, they believed that it is easy to wage war against this young king, but they were wrong. First, the Swedish army attacked against Denmark by Copenhagen, and after this they turned towards Estonia and towards Narva, which were sieged by Russian army. The first battles were very successful for Karl or Swedish army, and I would show only this map about the Battle of Narva, very briefly saying that there is fortress of Narva, sieged by Russian army, and then came the Swedish army from the west. Splendid victory in the dark November day. And then the Swedish army turned towards south and attacked Poland, and very many battles in northern Germany during the next years. But they were not so decisive battles. And then Karl and Swedish army turned towards Russia, which was advancing in Baltics. And they targeted Moscow, but had to turn towards south because they had difficulties in logistics. And we all know the Battle of Poltava, 1709, which was very decisive in this great war. Winner was Tsar Peter I, and the Swedish troops almost totally were destroyed here. And Karl flew to the Ottoman Empire for many years. It was very disastrous time for Finland and the Baltic provinces, because the Swedish army were in the south, and Finland was almost defenseless in the north. There were some steps during this phase: founding of St. Petersburg, founding of Russian Baltic Navy, and then Finland was, after Poltava 1709, almost open for Russian attacks. Ybor was lost 1710, and after Finnish soil battles in Napua, Russians used very disastrous tactics of scorched earth in Ostrobotnia, that is western Finland, against Sweden. And the peace treaty in Nystad, in Finnish Uusikaupunki, meant that Sweden lost all territories east coast of Baltic Sea. The Finnish borderline against Russia had then named the border of Peter the Great. It was foundation also of Russian Empire, and Tsar Peter took the name Imperator, Emperor. And then next the slide shows this whole situation in Europe. There were afterwards the Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire in the south, then France, and the Holy German Empire, which was very close alliance, and Britain. During the century, Poland and Lithuania was parted between Russia and Austria. Sweden during the Napoleonic Wars was like this, and then came year 1808, and the Russian army attacked Finland, and Sweden had to give up almost the whole Finland in that phase. And the Tsar or Emperor Alexander I promised Finland an autonomous status in Porvoo 1909. Finland became autonomous Grand Principality in Russian Empire. And this situation lasted whole century. Finland also, this Grand Principality got the old borderlines towards St. Petersburg, and in Finnish history this was first century in peace, whole century almost. After the Vienna Congress, Europe looked like this. Russia was now a great power by the Baltic Sea and taking part actively in European politics between the great powers that time. The next phase was the foundation of the Deutsche Kaiserreich, I say in German, 1871. It was very decisive for the next political situations, because it was now a new, very powerful great power in the middle of Europe. And we know that the First World War was very much concerning also Baltic Sea area. Germany and Russia fought many years here, and the sea was also battlefield very much in the war. Then I saw this Russian coastal defense system which had called up the Gulf of Finland. Russia built very strong fortresses both sides of Gulf of Finland. They are still there, but naturally they are not no more useful. And this was important thing during the next phase in the Second World War. Especially Stalin remembered this system, the sea fortress, because he was defending St. Petersburg, was named that time Petrograd, against interventions in 1919. And it was naturally a bad thing for Finland, because Stalin made a deal with Hitler. Hitler Stalin Pact is here the demarcation line between Russian and German interest. And for Finland it was disastrous because one result was winter war. Finland lost many areas in Western Karelia. Especially is interesting in this sense that exactly the same borderline as after peace treaty of Nystad was also after winter war, so-called border of Peter the Great, and it is still there. It is a long-lasting border. Germany occupied whole continental Europe in summer 1940, and the Soviet Union occupied Baltic states and Bessarabia, and there were only Sweden and Finland in that phase neutral countries, if we can say actually neutral during the World War. But for Finland, very important was the decision made by Hitler, Barbarossa plan, to have a first target in the offensive Leningrad, and naturally the Finnish territory was important in this situation, and it was basis for the battles in the summer 1941 in German attack, Finnish German attack there. The two first years in the Second World War were, as we all know, very successful first for Germany, and also Finland made offensive in the eastern Karelia and against railway of Murmansk. But then the end phases, we know, were very disastrous for whole Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and after the war very large areas were in ruins, and the Baltic Sea was filled with mines. The Cold War began with nuclear weapons. Actually, USA had very powerful air force and nuclear weapons, and almost overwhelming power during the first 10 years in the Cold War. But the Russian army was already in Germany, and this is a British-US threat scenario from 1948-49, which was basis for the military alliance NATO. This scenario lasted almost whole Cold War era, 40 years. In the middle of 50s, the situation in Europe was so that there were two powerful military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And it is interesting still that there between were Sweden and Finland, Switzerland and Austria, and also Yugoslavia as neutral or non-allied countries. And actually the main contact line between the Baltic Sea and Alps was rather short. It is shorter than the borderline now between Baltic states and Russia. And the Cold War front lines, it is also a picture of containment strategy by USA, shows that Europe was the stable area, and the battles, wars, there were in Asia, Indochina, Vietnam War, especially Korea War, and then in the Middle East, in the last phases of Cold War. But I will stress that the Baltic Sea area and Northern Europe was rather stable during the Cold War, actually all the time. The most dangerous thing was the threat of nuclear weapons. There were a very special role in Norwegian Air Force to keep open routes for US bombers. USA had in the 50s and early 60s about 10,000. It was so that until mid-60s, actually the US Air Force has 1,000 nuclear bombers, very good preparedness to fly against Russian objects, and the routes, many routes were on Finnish and Swedish territories. And the Soviet threat scenario in the end phase, especially during the Cold War, is shown here. They feared that the overwhelming US Air Force and the missiles and navies someday could attack like this. But there were also detente phase, especially important was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in Helsinki, 1975. And this was important 10 years later, when the ending of Cold War was acute. The Cold War in Europe was long-lasting still stand, and the people were under the threat of missiles and nuclear weapons, and the very large armies were against each other. 1 million military people, both sides of over the line, front line in Germany, were against each other. And in the end phase in the Baltic Sea area, there were very much heavy weaponry. I used the words that iron was enough in this area. They were very strong armies and heavy weapons. And then after the Cold War, we know this new situation, and I will only show this map because it shows this is German word Wende in Europe. It was really a very big change. I myself made this map in late 1991, the situation and geopolitical prospects, showing the change from the Central Europe towards East. And I will stress this fact that after the demise of Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union, the old Russian heartland is still strategic, very important area. And Finland lies still there, very near Russian mainland, Russian heartland. And new crises were in the south, in Balkans and in Caucasian area. But in the Baltic Sea, there were very heavy reductions. For example, especially Russian Baltic Navy almost totally disappeared. There were about 40 submarines, over 30 big surface vessels in the end of Cold War, and in the year here, 2016, only 2 submarines and 8 surface vessels. It means that the Baltic Sea is no more very important possible potential battlefield. And same thing was reductions of Russian land forces, garrisons in the east. This map shows that only very few land forces or land forces garrisons remained after this phase. New front line after the Der Spiegel map is here, but I will stress that nowadays there are no more so much heavy weapons, heavy military formations, no more so much nuclear weapons and so on. And therefore it is very good to say, so as in Der Spiegel, Nervenkrieg an der Ostseegrenze, not so much heavy concentration of military troops as during the Cold War. The Baltic Sea is more a cooperation area, more area for transport as for military purposes. And I show this Helcom as example of very effective cooperation in the Baltic Sea during the Cold War. It began already after 60s, and also during the tense situation in the 80s, it was very well working. And the HELCOM's main point is in Helsinki. And my conclusions are here in this slide, geopolitical assessments in the Baltic Sea. It has been no cause or source of conflict since the Second World War. It is very important thing. We have already 80 years peaceful time there. The sea area is no more a useful or important area for large-scale military operations. There are no remarkable strategic gains to achieve by landing over the sea. It is very difficult to imagine large-scale operations in the Baltic Sea nowadays. It is peaceful flank area in strategic sense in the present conflict of major powers. The origins and main points of the conflict are elsewhere, and so it is important to avoid horizontal escalation to the Baltic Sea area. There are still prevailing strategic and political stability, a balance of forces, and no imminent threat of military offensive. It would be useful for all parties in the region to keep the situation stable and avoid any risky provocation. That is my concluding words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please.
Oh, thank you. Very fun.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. And now we have to start our second panel, but I would like to ask the audience who are sitting here in this nice room and auditorium, do you have some questions to Pekka or to Mario? Still. But now we are going on with our conference with the second panel. Thank you very much. It is just online, and I would like to see is here our good cooperation partners and good speakers. Vaidotas, who is from Lithuania. Vaidotas is speaker of this panel, and he's the director of the National Defense Foundation in Lithuania. It is a non-profit organization which is also organizing different projects to contribute to the security of the Baltic region. And in this panel we have as well Professor Marko Kangaspuro from Finland, Michael Malm from Sweden, and Konstantin Egert from Russia. Larissa, yes, Kangaspuro. Thank you very much for all being here with us. And Vaidotas, the floor is yours. Now I will give you the floor to start this new interesting panel, which is talking about what we have to learn from the new start or Uusikaupunki treaty. What does it mean for us and how we have to think about geopolitical developments in Baltic Sea region. Thank you very much, Vaidotas.
Okay, Anneli, can you hear me?
Yes, it's fantastically good. You are like in Narva here in Estonia, but just now you are in Vilnius, as I suppose. Hello, Vilnius.
Yes, thank you for the kind introduction, and I just would like to remind that the panel discussion will be what can be learned from the NISTA Treaty, and we will have 3 speakers. Each of them will prepare presentations of approximately for 20 minutes, and after that the floor will be open for questions and answers. So I'm encouraging audience which is online to write down your questions to the messengers, the audience who is using Zoom platform, and of course the audience which is in Narva, live participation. We also will be able probably to hear your questions if you will have. Okay, now I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Marku Kangospuro. He is a director of Alexandria Institute, University of Helsinki. His academic experience covers Russian political development after the fall of the Soviet Union, development of Russian media space, political history of the Soviet Union, history of politics, identity politics, and nationalism. Professor, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizers also for inviting me to present and attend this panel with distinguished other panelists. I would first say that history is history, and New Start Peace Treaty is has occurred far past, and in principle we can't get any direct conclusions from it. But of course we can always learn something from history, and we can see and understand some historical developments concerning the Great Northern War and the results of the New Start Treaty. My topic was, or a given topic was, to focus this development from the perspective of Finland and Finnish society, and after Pekka Visuri's presentation, wide presentation on the geopolitics, it's quite easy to focus on this side. First, the starting point during the Great Northern War, it's ended to New Start Peace Treaty, and before this war, we have to remember that Finland's position in Sweden was that it was more or less, we can call it as well as Finland, we can call it as Eastern Province of Sweden. It was quite poor country, undeveloped country or area, province of Sweden, and it had to also to finance Swedish war efforts, plus give recruits or manpower to these wars all around the Europe. And this created in Finland a special, I would say that special and different societal and social situation as what was prevailing in this contemporary Swedish part of this kingdom. From this side we can say that when Finland was occupied by the Russian forces starting from 17 13, 14, and then in Napua was, like Visuri already mentioned, was this big, or big and big, but the biggest fight on the Finnish ground. The occupation army, Russian army, devastated Finnish area, and especially this midwest part of the Finland, Pohjanmaa, quite significant way. It was, of course, we know very well that it was a normal habit that the armies had to be more or less self-sufficient and to take use taxation and take food from the civilian population, and of course the discipline was also not so good at that time in armies. It developed it only later on, and it was quite a big catastrophe in Finland. And in Finland, this occupation and situation before the New Start Treaty, it has been named as a great hatred. We don't know exact figures, but it is said that about, or estimated that at least 5,000 Finns died and perished, and from, again, nobody knows exact figures, but from 10 to 20,000 were captured and then brought to Russia, like a slavery work. Part of them were sent to build St. Petersburg, New St. Petersburg, and part of them to different parts of the Russian Empire. Probably, again, an estimation about 2,000 returned later on. Last one returned about 10 years after the New Start Treaty back to Finland, and a big number of them either perished or part of them also stayed more or less voluntary in Russia, starting a new life there, especially the kids who were captured and taken by Russians. And this left, of course, I would say that the biggest influence and consequence of this, not this New Start Treaty, but of this occupation, great hatred, was that it is a part of Finnish popular culture and cultural heritage, which has also defined the so-called popular understanding or picture of what Russia is and what Russians are, and what kind of threat it is to Finland. It has been, this popular picture and narration has been used very actively time to time in Finland and Finnish politics and Russian politics as well. It's, in this way, it has been a living historical capital for Finland and Finland's societal and political discussion. If not as important as the Winter War, but still very important, and very often also connected to the discussions of the Winter War. Of course, beyond these human sacrifices, the economy and agriculture was more or less devastated, especially on the areas where the fightings occurred, and less in the southern Finland and more in the midwest part of the Finland, where these main fights were launched and clashes were occurred. Probably the second consequence in Finland of this New Start Treaty was that Finland it probably sowed the seed in Finnish society not to trust anymore more so unconditionally to Swedish ability and willingness, I mean grounds of King's ability and willingness, or Stockholm's ability and willingness to defend Finland's eastern border and to take into consideration interest of the population in Finland. There were many reasons for that, and there were difficulties also after the New Start Peace Treaty to return to normal life. Officials who took office and charge of leading and governing Finnish districts and areas and organizing the civilians' life, they were, quite many of them were invited from Baltic states, which were ceded to Russia, and Stockholm, so-called, I would say, followed the normal empire's logic, that it didn't matter so much that what was the nationality and the rules of the rulers who were sent to the rule these different parts of the empire or kingdom. And these newcomers, they came a slightly different culture. They didn't have got to use to circumstances, and also independent peasants like Finland had at that time, and there was also not only among them but also returning unprofessional other rulers, new rulers, and rulers they were corrupt, part of them were corrupted, and that kind of all issues which make difficult to return to the peace, I mean peaceful life and peace economy and society. And this, I would say that this continued, and it was the parallel development with the development in Sweden, which I believe that my colleagues on this panel will tell more about, but we are speaking about this difference of the between different parties of the Sweden Hats again, who had the idea to get the revenge from Russia and then return the ceded areas, closed areas in New Start Treaty. And then they started or waited exactly only the good situation to wage a new war, and then and to get strength and new alliances also to support this attempt. And then opposite side of them were the so-called nightcaps, whose policy was more moderate, and these nightcaps' social background were more or less the peasantry as well, priests and so forth, and political and elite and people in Finland who had experienced this Russian occupation and were really tired about the whole war burdens, and then for that reason the ideas of revanchist policy towards Russia was not very popular, never after that in Finland. Exception, of course, we will find exceptions later, a couple of 100 years later on, but at that time. And in any case, what concerns to Finland was that as a result of this revanchist policy of Stockholm, when the Hats got the leadership, they launched a badly prepared attack to Russia, and it was, as I mentioned, it was not very popular also in Finland. From Sweden lost areas from Finland, quite big areas, and at that time in Finnish population didn't resist also same way like in the during the Great Northern War, the Russian army and part of the society and also political and administrational elite started to cooperate with Russian occupiers to organize somehow civilian life during the Russian new power there. And in this situation came also as I would say that from Russian side was invented a new policy towards Finland. And I mean the Elizabeth's manifest which promised the independence or autonomy to Finland. It occurred also, it was of course diplomatic, populistic, political maneuver to try to weaken Sweden and the resistance of the army and to influence to Sweden, and especially to Finland. But it started to sequence of the developments and initiatives which were repeated during the Gustav III's war, attack Russia in 1788, and again we can see some kind of continuation in during the Napoleonic Wars and when Sweden lost finally in 1809 Finland to Russia. So in this way we can't say that this was determined by the New Start Treaty, but it's launched the circumstance, create the new geopolitical and political circumstances which for different reasons leaded to that development which we are living at the moment. I think that this was what I wanted in the start to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kongaspuro, sorry for pronunciation. I think we will leave questions to the end after all presenters will speak. So now I would like to invite second speaker, Mr. Michael Malm. And Mr. Michael Malm, he's a senior advisor at the Swedish Armed Forces Defense Staff, Department of Total Defense. Michael have among other things worked for the Swedish Air Forces, Swedish Defense University, Swedish Defense Research Agency, and the Baltic Defense College. So, Michael, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vaidas. It's good to be on this panel and talking about the New Start Treaty from a Swedish perspective. And I agree with Michael. What can you really learn from an historical event like the New Start Treaty? I think there's some overall lessons learned or some interesting points that you can pick up from this area, and I will come back to that. I will also say that I speak for myself and not on behalf of my organization, even though I'm working at the Swedish Defense Staff. One thing that I reflected upon when I listened to the different presentations is that sometimes you have to write what you saw. And what I mean by that is that basically the Swedish Vikings went east and created the Empire of Rus that we now seem to have a little bit problem with. Okay, let's talk about the New Start Peace Treaty. and the impact it had on Sweden. Of course, the peace treaty in Ystad marked the end of Sweden as a great power. And of course, it also marked the Russian Empire's emerging as a great power in the wider Baltic Sea area. And what can we learn from this? What can we take with us? I think one of the overall lessons that can be learned from the Great Northern War and the peace treaty and the history that came after that is that change is the only constant. Change is the only constant. Who is winning and who is losing, that's always changes. Who is your enemy and who is your ally seems to also change. Empires, they come and empires go. And I was asked once what I thought about the future, or if I could predict the future. And I said, the only thing I can predict about the future is that I'm going to die. I don't know how, I don't know when, and I don't know in what circumstance, but I'm absolutely convinced that I once will die. That's the only thing I am absolutely sure about. Everything else is pure speculation. And I think that's the same thing if we look to the future from where we are today and try to predict what will happen. It's purely speculations, interesting speculations perhaps, but still they are only speculations. And if you look back, you can always say, I know what was going to be the result of the New START Treaty because I can see it in the mirror. But at the time, I don't think anyone had a clue what the future would look like after the New START Treaty. There is a very interesting Buddhist story that also goes on the same theme that I think you have to have in mind when you think about development. Now I can hear someone is talking simultaneously as I do. I think someone needs to mute. Thank you. The story is about an old man who has a horse and he has a son. One Buddhist monk come and visit him and they sit down and talk. And the old man says, I'm so happy with what I have, and I'm happy that I have a son, and I am happy that I have a horse. And the monk says, well, you never know if that's a good thing or if that's a bad thing. You just have to be in the moment and do what you have to do. And the day after, when the man looked out of the window, he saw that the horse had run away. And he said, oi, 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 what am I going to do now? I don't have a horse. And the monk said, well, you never know. You never know if it's going to be a good thing or if it's going to be a bad thing. You just have to deal with the situation as it is. And the day after, when the man looked outside, he saw 50 horses standing outside. So his horse had met the wild horses and brought them to the farm. And the man said, wow, now I have 51 horses. God is good. This will be the happiest moment of my life. And the monk said, you never know what the result will be. So just go with the flow, take what you have, and do what you have to do. And his son went up on one of the horses, and he was kicked off, and he broke his leg. And the man said, Jesus, who's going to help me at the farm? My son has broken legs, he can't do anything. And the monk said, well, that's the situation right now, you just have to deal with it. And the next day, a bunch of bandits came, and they took all the young men in the village, except for the son, the old man's son, because he had a broken leg, so he was of no use. And you can understand what the monk said. Well, go with it and you have to deal with what happens, and you can never predict if it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think having that story in mind, you never know what will lead to another thing. Will that be a good thing or will it be a bad thing? And I think if you look at the development after the New START Treaty, you can see both in Finland and in Sweden, there have been good things happening and there have been bad things happening. Another overall lesson I think you can draw from this period is that defeat seems to make change easier because you have to change. If you are victorious, why change? And if you are not victorious, why not change? So I think a defeat could also be a trigger for change. And that I think we can see, and I will come back to that later in my speech. And absolutely, Sweden was defeated. We was defeated in every sense of the meaning. Economically, socially, militarily, politically, in every sense we were defeated. Since 1611, Sweden had been expanding, becoming more and more powerful, gaining more and more territories, and we peaked 1658 after the peace in Roskilde. And now, then, for almost 70 years, this was the first peace treaty where we lost territory. And Sweden, and as some other have said before, was economically in ruin. Sweden and Finland was economically in ruin. I think that we had at least a quarter of our population had died either from the war itself or from the plague. And we, of course, as you know, we had a small population from the very beginning. Sweden at the time was or had become an extreme autocracy. You could say that during Karl XII, we lived under a dictatorship with the king at the top. And Charles XII, he was also the only king that refused to pay tribute to the parliament. All the other kings have given a sort of proclamation what they will do and not do. And in that proclamation, you also have some limitations of the king's mandate. Charles XII, he didn't do that. He said, "I'm only responsible before God. God is the one who is guiding me, and I will only not only talk with God, but I only will be responsible before God." The other thing is that we didn't have any real opposition in the country, nor in Finland nor in Sweden. Of course, people were talking about the king, wishing him to die, wishing change, but there were no real opposition that really took action. Some of them, in private books, said that the only thing they could hope for was that the king would die. And since he took such risks in his wars, the chance for the king to die was quite big. But the only way to change they saw was that the king himself died. And there could be a lot of reasons for why the king had such a power, or this particular king had such a power. And I think we could have a seminar just about that. Another thing we have to understand that Sweden at that time was not a country with an army. Sweden was an army who had a country. I think you could argue that what Sweden did during this period was conducting total war in the sense of Erik Ludendorff. I mean by mobilizing all parts of the country just for the war effort, to whatever cost it may take. Everything was focused on the war effort. And as Marcus said, the people in Sweden and particularly in Finland just had to prepare and help the war effort. That was the only thing that counted. And the king himself was very explicit about that. He said, I don't care, do what you have to do in order to get new recruits, new horses, new weapons, etc., etc., etc. So I think we could say that what happened during this period was an example of total war as it came to be known during the 1930s. It's wrong to say that when the king died, all this triggered a revolution. There wasn't any revolution in the sense that we had 1809 when Sweden revolted, or parts of the Swedish elite revolted against Gustav IV and brought him down. So there wasn't any revolution, but there was a general agreement between the four estates in the parliament, the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, and the farmers, that change was needed. Change was needed. Perhaps that was the only thing they really agreed upon, but still, they agreed that change was needed. We can't have the same way of governing the country. It was not a change in the sense that we now have to become a military power again. It was more to create a different social order, and especially when it comes to governance. Who should govern? What should be the limitation of the government? What will be the king's role in the new government? And of course, the nobility had its reasons for wanting this. The farmers, something else. The clergy and the burghers as well. But since the general agreement was that things have to change, change happened. And this was what happened actually was an important step in the modernization of Sweden. I don't think if we have continued on the old path, Sweden had been a very bad country even today. So I think that this first step in the modernization of Sweden was extremely important. And doing this, and what they did was basically they crafted a new constitution, and they did that at the same time as Sweden was at war, and also at the same time had peace negotiations with Russia. So it was a rather turbulent time. And basically it was two people who crafted this new constitution of 1720. And with that new constitution, Sweden became a constitutionally governed country. That we hadn't been for at least 50 years. And I would say before that we was not a constitutionally governed country either, but in some sort anyway. And in this new constitution, the parliament became the center of power in Sweden, with representation of the four estates. And I think it's worth mentioning that different from other countries in Europe, the farmers was rather well represented in the parliament, for instance, in Sweden. They didn't have as much power as the clergy and the nobility together, but they still had a voice in the Swedish parliament. This period that we entered into is called in Sweden the Age of Freedom. And as Marcus said, during that period, a party system began to evolve. The two parties that Mark mentioned, the hats and the caps. And this was not without problem. One problem, as Mark mentioned, was that the hats wanted revenge on Russia and triggered at least 2 wars with Russia, where Sweden was defeated. The caps was more moderate and wanted more a consolidation of Sweden as a country. But Sweden was not very used to have this kind of a party system, so this area is also described as extremely chaotic. And perhaps didn't serve Sweden so well as it should. The corruption increased, etc., etc. But this was the beginning of a new social order in Sweden, a new social order that we really needed. We got a parliamentary system with certain similarities to today. The working traditions that we have in the parliament, particularly when it comes to our committee system, have their roots in this age of freedom. And also, during this age of freedom, we can see the emergence of the new public administrative model. That was a sort of a by-effect, a side effect of this new constitution, the Swedish public administrative model. Some people say that our public administrative model was the creation of Axel Oxenstierna, but that's actually is wrong. Axel Oxenstierna was an extreme centralist, and in this new public administrative model you can see decentralization and dualism as the main features. And one feature, as I said, is the dualism of the system, which means that there is a relatively high degree of autonomy that Swedish state agencies enjoy in the relationship to the government. The government can give directions and set limitations, but it's basically the national state agencies that has the power to do something. And that feature came into place with the Constitution of 1720. Another feature is the responsibility. And what I mean by that, if you are responsible for something in the government in peacetime, you are also responsible for in wartime. So the national agencies at that time called colleges were responsible for everything in their particular responsibility area, both in peacetime and wartime. And in Sweden, in the beginning at least, a number of colleges had more wartime responsibilities that they also had to take care of in peacetime. The administrative model that was created also consisted of 3 levels. 3 levels that were already in place but became a part of the Constitution more formally. One level is the national level with the king and the governor. You had a regional level with the governor, and then you had a local level based on a parish. This model that was created as a result of the Constitution of 1720 with its basic features is still in place today in our modern public administrative model. Of course, we have done a number of adoptions and changes. Today we have, instead of at the local level, the model is not based on parishes, but on municipalities. On the regional level, we have today 21 county administrative boards. And of course, on the national level, we have the government. The feature of dualism that I talked about was also combined with decentralization and a responsibility that the different agencies or colleges, as I said, they were called, had to cooperate within the system. And today, when we are now rebuilding our truth defense system, this administrative model is one of the main cornerstones in doing so. So I will just conclude my short speech with that the founding fathers of the Constitution of 1720 still serve us very well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for very comprehensive and concise presentation. Now I would like to invite our last speaker, but not the least, Mr. Konstantin von Egert. And he is a freelance journalist and political commentator. He writes a weekly column on Russian affairs for Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster. He also hosts trending Deutsche Welle's interview program. In 2016 and 18, Konstantin Egert was program host and political commentator for TV Rain, Russia's groundbreaking independent TV channel. He also worked for Kommersant, Russia's oldest private media group. 2009 and 10, Mr. Egert was vice president for public and government affairs for ExxonMobil Russia Corporation. In 2002 and 2009, he was Moscow bureau chief of BBC Russian service. In 2008, Her Majesty the Queen created Mr. Egert honorary member of Order of the British Empire. He's a summa cum laude graduate of the Moscow University Institute of Asian and African Studies. Also, he speaks English, French, and Arabic languages. So, Konstantin, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that I only speak in the personal capacity. And my views, they have nothing to do with Deutsche Welle or any other organization, because I only work for myself. And I would like to continue a bit on where Professor Martin left. I think that this idea that the end of the world of Russia, the new Staatsräte, were somehow the beginning of the end of the Swedish Empire. Well, it's quite interesting because, of course, the end probably finally came in 1809 when Sweden lost Finland to the Russian Empire. And many times, my Swedish friends, and by the way, beside me is the panorama of Stockholm, where my mother was born nearly a century ago. So my Swedish friends said to me that in the end, the defeat in the so-called Modern War, and then the defeat in 1809, were blessings in disguise, because after that, Sweden shed its imperial ambitions and became a modern state as we know it today, with modern, I would say, social democratic state in many ways, which is at peace with itself and with the state. I think that this is something that many of my Russian friends never really understood. Because the idea of greatness and greatness as exemplified by the military glories, by conquests, by expanding the territory, it was always and still is ingrained in the political, and I would say geopolitical thinking of the Russian ruling class. And this brings us back to the Neustadt treaty and to basically the war.
Konstantin, can I interrupt you a little bit? There is noise there, so maybe you should switch Estonian translation, or because you have we hear some Estonian translation.
Yes, I do hear it too. I don't know how to do it.
Okay, but it is not in your computer.
I think I hear the noise, but I don't know what to do about it. I can reconnect.
No, I think maybe you should close web browser.
Oh, maybe. Let me see. Let me see.
Can I interrupt you a little bit? There is noise there, so maybe you should switch Estonian translation.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now sounds good.
Oh, good.
Proceed, please proceed, Konstantin.
Yes, I'm sorry. So very briefly to repeat, for those who didn't hear me, I speak only for myself and not for DW, which I do write a weekly column, as you rightly said. Secondly, I think that some things that Professor Marlin said are very important because if you look back, then after the Treaty of Neustadt and then after the defeat in 1809 war with Russia, after which Sweden lost Finland, Sweden moved into the kind of modern and now probably even postmodern stage of state development and became a democracy and a social democracy that we know it today. And many Swedes, and I'm speaking as the panorama of Stockholm, where my mother was born nearly a century ago. Many Swedes, my Swedish friends, always were telling me that this is a wonderful example of how Sweden shed its imperial ambitions and became a normal state without any kind of territorial expansion. However, these ideas were never understood, I think, in conversation by most of my Russian friends, and to some extent you could say that looking back 300 years, Peter the Great's mindset aimed at territorial expansion, military glories, and so on and so forth, still informs the thinking of the current Russian ruling class. And in this respect, I think the lessons of that war are very interesting, and of that peace for that matter, because let us remember that this was a war that was fought for more than 20 years on a vast scale, from the Baltic Sea to central Ukraine and to what used to be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the time. And this brings me to the idea that basically the consequences of what happened then are still with us. If you look at the how you call it, the dramatis personae, the cast of the historical cast of participants of those events, well, among other people, they include the Ukrainian hetmans, Ivan Mazepa, who basically became the enemy of the Russian Tsar, and Ivan Skoropadsky, who then succeeded him and basically tied the Cossacks, tied this part of Ukraine closer to the fate of the Russians. Today, among a lot of controversy, statues of Mazepa are unveiled in Ukraine. There are several streets named after him in major Ukrainian cities, and he is one of those figures of controversy between modern Russia and modern Ukraine, which, by the way, as we speak, are in a state of a frozen military conflict. And I think this is a very interesting, if you wish, a historical flashback, because this is how history invades modernity. Mazepa was a kind of a slightly cardboard villain from Pushkin's Poland for us when we studied in a Soviet school. Nowadays, he's one of the most controversial figures which inspire hatred in Russia and adoration in certain parts of Ukraine. So, in a sense, that war is still with us, just as it is with us because it was, it marked a very significant, stage in the weakening and decomposition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which actually led 70 years later, or even say 50 years after the war, to the first partition of Poland, and then the second partition of Poland, and then the third partition of Poland, after which the Polish state disappeared. Its regeneration in the 20th century led to some extent, to a renewed stage of Russian-Polish, Soviet-Polish confrontation, which to some extent is still with us. Look at the Kremlin's attempts to impose its version of Second World War, and especially 1939-1941 period, on the Russian public opinion and on the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. These are the battles that are being fought as we speak here in Narva. And by the way, Narva is, in this respect, quite important because the Baltic states today, they experience, to a large extent, the full brunt of Russia's desire to replay the results of the Cold War and create this sphere of influence, this buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe, and deny Ukraine, Georgia, and other states aspirations to form their own security alliances as they want, as their sovereign state. So I think that to some extent the legacy of that war still impacts our life today. And what is even more interesting is that even some of the concepts of that era still play out in our midst today. If you look at the Belarusian relations, if I may say so today, this is part still of this drive westwards which Peter the Great to a large extent exemplified. And the fact that maybe very soon Belarus will disappear as a sovereign state in all but name, maybe, is to a large extent a continuation of the great power rivalry that existed 300 years ago. Today it's not Sweden, although Sweden is not even part of NATO, but it's more, I would say, NATO, the West lines, versus Russia. But to a large extent, the lens where the confrontation, potential confrontation, could happen, and that is something we cannot exclude, are the same lens that were the battlefields of the Great Northern War. That alliances that are being considered today, namely, for example, the Lithuanian, Polish, Ukrainian alliance, the initiative of 3C, this is something that brings us back straight to the Baltic Sea rivalries of the time and to the attempts of the Polish and Ukrainian Commonwealth to keep its sovereignty and independence. And of course, the Battle of Poltava, which was part of that war, 1709, is still, to a large extent, a symbol of Russian military glory to the Russians, and a very controversial and difficult passage in the history of Ukraine, which means that we are actually doomed to see this, the battles of historia, long after, I hope eventually, Russia and Ukraine managed to settle their differences and come to some kind of maybe cold but still peace. And that, I would say, is also important in a sense at this conference, I think, because so frequently historical lessons of history, historical reminiscences are something that a lot of people living outside of Central East Europe and the Baltics and the Nordic countries find quite strange. I don't want to criticize anyone, but of course, if you look at the views of history and the sense of history, to the west of the Oder River, west of the Oder-Neisse, it's completely different. And countries over there, let's say the older members of the EU and NATO, do feel very frequently disconnected from these events. To some extent, I think the Neustadt Treaty and the story of the Russian-Swedish Northern War is a reminder that questions that existed today to some extent exist now, because these are questions of sovereignty and independence of modern European states that regained their independence in the interbellum period and then after the end of the Cold War. And I suppose that what needs to be done, I think, is a very, very concise effort at historical education of not only the peoples of Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics. These peoples are, to a large extent, aware of the last several hundred years of history. But I think, to a large extent, the Western Europe needs to rediscover the complex and, to some extent, very modern history of our area, of the area between, say, Moscow and the Oder, that still impacts our lives today. To close, I would like to say that such conferences are very, very important, but I think that launching, let us say, permanent web presence, web resources, and basically analyze history in retrospective and perspective is important. It's something that is an unfinished business to a large extent, and something that, especially for Russia and Ukraine, is a very, 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 very modern and very, very politically relevant task. I do think that we all should look towards the future. The nearest future may look quite dangerous in our region due to the tensions that exist between Moscow and the neighbors. But I think historical analysis, uncovering multiple facets of history, is something that works towards the future. And in the end, even the 20 years of war ended by peace. So let's hope we'll see peace in our time, and peace and prosperity in our time. In our thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Konstantin, for a nice presentation. Now we are open for questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat. So maybe Anneli, your audience has some questions.
Yes, hello from Narva. So now is the possibility to ask questions from our speakers. Azam? Yes, there are some questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I see
No, any questions in the chat?
Someone sent in the chat. I have a question.
Just say a few words in respectful disagreement, Alexander. Alexander? Oh, yes. But I would like to introduce Timo Hellenberg, our co-organizer here, who is representing that kind of institution like Hellenberg International. And Timo is very keen to handle history and his family history, and he's a very good expert and worked very close together with Estonian institutions. And to organize this conference about Uusikaupunki or Neustadt Treaty, it was his idea. So thank you to you all who talked today in our panel and so on. And I would like to give the floor to Timo Hellenberg. Please, Timo, floor is yours. And yes, please.
Thank you, Anneli. Thank you, Vaidatas, and thank you all the speakers on my behalf. I think that it has been a very successful day for all of us today, and I would like to thank our speakers of this panel, particularly Konstantin, Michael, Markku. And if I may, I would have one question for all of you. After very enlightening, informative presentations, I can't help but thinking that whatever the time after the Neustadt Treaty, the following 200 years, whatever this time was more peaceful for us than the time before it. And I have still final notes, so I just put it very shortly for you, all of you, to reflect this question. How do you feel about this? That when we compare 200 years before the Neustadt Treaty, the devastating time of the Livonian Wars, of course the 30 Years' War in the middle of Europe, and then the Great Northern War, of course it was absolutely a catastrophe. It was the human catastrophe for all of us. But I would like to ask now our keynote speakers, Konstantin, Michael and Markku, to reflect on this, and maybe we could start from Markku. How do you look at this issue? Thank you.
So thank you, Timo. I would also thank my other panelists for really interesting presentations. It was interesting to listen to you and learn something new as well. But to your question, Timo, I think that I can't actually compare it this way, that which period has been the worst or better, because these two periods before the Neustadt Treaty and after that one, they have been so different, different Europe and then different Northern Europe, Baltic Sea area. After Neustadt Treaty, we have experienced the industrialized war where killing was very systematic and it was used very systematic methods and consciously devastation of the enemy, actually the full attempts to full devastations as well, but the means of the use of power and military power and kill and devastate, they were so huge already during the industrialization. And at the edge of the entering to the, this industrialized period of our time, that this makes it different. And also war preparations, to launch a war, they needed time and more planning, and they were somehow, before the Neustadt Treaty, the organizational way of the societies and states, they differ so much of the nation states be established after the beginning of the 20th century. And for that reason, I think that it's so difficult to compare.
Yes.
They were really different.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much, Markku. And before I give floor to Michael and Konstantin, I would like to use this opportunity because we have very rare opportunity to have Swedish ambassador Mikael Eriksson with us today. And Ambassador Eriksson has served as ambassador of Sweden to Republic of Azerbaijan before, and he has previous diplomatic postings, including Swedish Embassy in Ottawa, where he served as a deputy head of mission, and Swedish permanent representation to the European Union, where he held position of the anti-gay counselor and Swedish delegation to the OECD. So, Mr. Ambassador, Your Excellency, would you like to reflect on this issue? And particularly, we would like to hear your views on our topic today, the New START Treaty, Peace Treaty, and 300 years memorandum of the Great Northern War. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just check first so that you can hear me and see me.
Yes.
Yes, very good. Okay, so thank you so much to you for inviting me to this important conference, and also, of course, to the speakers. I wasn't able to join you from the very start. I would have been delighted to say a few introductory words, but I had other obligations. But I'm really happy that you gave me the opportunity to say just a few short words towards the end of this seminar. I think from my perspective as a non-historian, but as a diplomat, I can say that this year, 2021, has been a year where history has been very present in our endeavors, in our work here, and that's true not only for the Swedish embassy, but certainly for, I think, all of the embassies here in Estonia, in Tallinn. As you know, most of you, we have been celebrating, most of us, the centenary of diplomatic relations. Many of us recognize Estonia as a free country, independent country in 1921, early in the year, and we have been celebrating that throughout the year. And of course, perhaps even more importantly, the restoration of Estonian independence, the regaining of independence 30 years ago. So these are two celebrations that we have been carrying out throughout the year. And looking further back in history, it's 400 years since Gustav Adolf II entered Riga, establishing Swedish Livonia. And then, of course, we have the particular subject of today, the 300-year anniversary of the peace treaty of New START. I think what is the common denominator among the other events, maybe the 400-year anniversary is debatable, but certainly the centenary and the 30-year anniversary, both of them have been causes for celebration. We have looked back and remembered and rejoiced in very successful developments and joyful events. So that has been, on the whole, a very positive looking back through history. But I think from a diplomatic perspective, it's just as important to look back at those events in history which do not necessarily lead us to celebrate, but which we should remember nevertheless. And they might be, they might be problematic, or they might even be painful in some respects. But that perhaps makes it even more important to look back and learn from those experiences. And I think it was Mikael Malm who said earlier, a few moments ago, that defeat is a trigger to change. And I think for Sweden, certainly the New Start Treaty was indeed the manifestation of a big defeat, and in that sense it has been for many people a bit of a painful memory. But that should not, definitely not lead us to conclude that we shouldn't learn from it. On the contrary, I think it's even more important. And I think also Konstantin just a few moments ago, in a very good way, sort of tied these experiences from history to today's current situation in our neighborhood, the security context which we are now living in and which we have debated extensively over the past few days. We just had a very interesting conference here in Tallinn, the Lennart Meri Security Conference, which is always one of the prime occasions in this region to discuss security-related issues in our neighborhood. So I just wanted to make this link between, first of all, the need to learn not only from, well, to learn especially from bad memories of history, and to celebrate, of course, where there is reason to celebrate, and also to tie these experiences to what we know of the situation today, and possibly also what we can foresee in the future. So I think for all these reasons, I very much welcome this conference. I think what I have heard in the afternoon has been very, very interesting and enlightening. And I would like once again to say thank you very, very much to the organizers and also, of course, to the speakers who have come before me. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for very, very welcoming words and your professionalism and participation. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of the organizers. And if you can stay with us for a couple of minutes more so we can finish our panel also. So I would like to ask Konstantin to continue and maybe to reflect what Ambassador brought up and also what I asked earlier about whether the time after the New Start Treaty was actually more calm and peaceful than the 200 years before. I know it's a little bit provocative question, but on the other hand, this is academic initiative. Please. Konstantin, can you unmute? You cannot. Okay.
Excuse me, Timo, if yes. Konstantin is not answered, we have another speaker who would like to ask question, Mr. Alexander von Hagen.
He has a question.
I know I'm muted myself.
Yes. Okay, please.
But I can give floor to Alexander. That's no problem.
Okay, maybe let's give floor to Alexander and then Konstantin will continue. Okay, Alexander, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think we continue, Konstantin. Can you take over? Please.
Alexander can't unmute himself.
Yes, Konstantin.
I have done it.
All right.
Okay, Konstantin.
After you, Konstantin, sorry.
Yeah, well, I do think that maybe to add to what I said, it's a bit of a reminiscence, or rather probably a book recommendation. The famous British historian Norman Davies wrote several very good books, but one of them is called Disappeared Kingdom. And it is about states that disappears in the whole Soviet Union. And although Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and now Ukraine exist, but of course they all exist in most of the Central East European and Baltic capitals, as well as in Kiev and Moscow. So I would say that one has to be a very diligent student of history in order to understand what goes on now in this huge space where the war we talked about today was fought. And I think that it's we had a debate in Tallinn at the Narva conference, which the ambassador mentioned, actually about it was about the developments inside Russia. But I think that one of the things that are overlooked by outside observers is that Vladimir Putin's Russia, and actually Putin himself, have of course a certain idea of what Russia is and what it should be. It may not be to everybody's liking, but I think that this is something that's being overlooked. In all the cliches about him clinging to power, of course he clings to power, he wanted to recreate the Soviet Union. I know he doesn't want the Soviet Union, but he wants something else. And I think in this respect, if one doesn't look at historical events of the last, as it turned out today, of the last 300 years at least, you are doomed to not be able to understand the reasoning and the political action, strategic action, military action sometimes, that actors in the current big game in Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans make. So once again, thanks for the invitation, and I would like to go out after Alexander speaks, because I told Timo and the rest of us, I do have stuff to do.
Yes.
But thanks very much for the moderation.
Thank you, Konstantin, very much for very valuable points and very good presentation. And we understand your time pressure with the timing. So, Michael, please reflect on the previous comments and the question I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. I will just reflect on your questions, and if I play with a little bit with numbers, we are commemorating what happened 1721. If I'm back in my history book to 1521, how was the situation in Sweden? Well, actually, we were fighting a war of independence against Denmark. We wanted to become sovereign. We wanted to end the Kalmar Union. And Denmark wanted us to stay in that union because they were extremely powerful and more powerful with us within it. And we struggled for independence. And if I step forward to 1921, you could argue that that was the year when we were fully a democracy, because everybody in Sweden had a right to vote. Before that, women did not have the right to vote, but 1921 they got the right to vote. So you could say that we were more or less a full democracy by 1921. If you now step to 2021, is democracy, is that threatened or is it still strong? I would say it's very strong, but we can't take it for a given. That's my comments.
Thank you, Michael. Very, very good. And why don't I give the floor now to you. I would like to thank Mr. Ambassador and our speakers, Markku, Konstantin, Michael. And why don't could you take over and check if we have questions now for the speakers, and then we conclude this session. Thank you.
Okay, so if we are approaching to the conclusion, so the clear message from our speakers that what is constant is a change. But I also have a point that in this environment, probably Russia is most permanent, because from the perspective of aggression. And also, I course, still here, and they are dealing with it. But also the nature and geopolitical environment has drastically changed. So we have, democracy ally, and also dictatorship ally. And besides that, we also live in very new environment, which is called informational technologies, which is also a challenge for our societies to understand and how to cope with that. And I think I'm concluding this session, and Timo, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vaidata. So thank you for all the speakers of this session. Thank you, Michael, Konstantin, Ambassador Eriksson, and thank you, Marko Kanaspro also. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Colonel Vaidotas Malionis for your excellent moderation and being one of the main organizers today. I think we are approaching the final notes of this conference, and I must say that it has been a long road together. It has been a real personal pleasure and honor to serve as one of the organizers of this first Narva History Forum here at the Narva College. I have been working in academic life for 35 years, and I must say that this particular event and this joint initiative, together with NGO Ida-Virumaa itself, together with National Defense Foundation of Lithuania and our company Helleberg International, has been most pleasant and educative experience. I would like to thank our excellent speakers today, an active audience. I would also like to thank the technical staff for their professionalism, particularly Kalle, Pavel, and our excellent translators and the translation team. Today we have heard and learned a lot about the past, our common past. And like Konstantin Eckert pointed out in his excellent presentation, among the other good presentations, the historical context of the New START Treaty is still with us today. We are living it together. I hope that you have enjoyed today's program. And dear friends, if you allow me a little bit, I would like to deviate a little bit from the usual concluding remarks as an example. In 1579, when Sweden had very difficult times, of course we were part of the Sweden, Estonian, Finland, there was a battle in Narva without success. At the same time, Poland started a warfare against Russian Empire without success. It was a serious setback for the Moscow. Swedish warfare continued successfully later on in the Baltics, and Narva was finally conquered in 1581. I would like to extend now my gratitude to also one of our supported organization, the Swedish Riksarkivet in Stockholm, also on behalf of my personal interests. In this battle of Narva, there was one man who died. He fell in the midst of the most fearful battle. His name was Bernt Johan Taube. He was killed here in the fight between the Swedish army and the Russian forces. Soon after, his only son, Ludwig Taube, also fell here in Narva. on February 4th, 1590, in the so-called long battle against Russia. So father and son both killed in the warfare. Later on, his son, Bernd Taube von der Rissen, actually my great-great-grandfather in the 11th generation, served in the Swedish army for 50 years, so half a century, as a colonel of the Weber Cavalry Regiment. It's quite illustrative that it took another 3 generations until the wars in Finland, in current Estonia, finally ceased as a result of the peace treaty, New Start peace treaty on September 10th, 1721. A lot of tragedy, a lot of destruction before that. So, dear friends, dear colleagues, there is one thing which unites us today here. What is it? It's our common desire for peace. Never again wars. No more unrest, no destruction. Narva is a place, I would say, where this issue is better understood than anywhere else in Northern Europe. I would like to thank our partners today, National Defense Foundation of Lithuania, the director Vaidotas Maljonis. And I would also like to thank NGO Ida-Virumaa itself and the director Ida-Virumaa. Anneli, could I ask you to come here with me? And on behalf of all the other organizers, we'd like to thank you especially for hard work to organize this first Narva History Forum. We have done it with small resources, putting ourselves on it, and here we are today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Koljo, thank you. Yes.
So I would conclude on my behalf that it has been a learning curve, it has been excellent experience, and we have been blessed with the fact that Ambassador Eriksson has been with us today and having had time for us. Suur tänu ka kaikille kohale tulnud Narva ja Ida-Virumaa inimestele. Aitäh huvi eest meie ühise ajaloo ja ühise tuleviku vastu. Aitäh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on my behalf, I would like to thank you all, our audience, our technical supporters, our interpreters, all the speakers in different countries. I think it's just the beginning of a long way to talk more and more about history in Estonia, in Livonia, in the Baltic Sea region, because we in Estonia and in Narva especially, we need to know what was happened in history, and so it can shape our better future. Thank you very much once more, and we will meet again, I hope absolutely so. Thank you.
Thank you. The seminar is closed, and we will come back to all the registered